X-Wings, TIE Fighters, and very cheap enemy placement are just a few of the things to be found in Jedi Outcast. But is this third installment in the series worth going back to revisit, or is it best left in the past? Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to my review of Jedi Outcast. While there have been many Star Wars games released for many platforms over the years, there haven't been that many story-driven first-person shooters. In fact, outside of 2005's Republic Commando, which on balance, despite some flaws, I still think is an enjoyable game, there has only really been the Dark Forces series, which of course later morphed into the Jedi Knight series. The original Dark Forces upon release was more of a thinking person shooter, as opposed to the more formulaic structure of games like Doom. Instead of just needing to get from the start of the level to the end, you actually had to accomplish objectives along the way. Likewise, traditional red, blue and yellow doors were replaced with far greater interaction with the environment. Outside of the gameplay mechanics, Dark Forces also featured a fairly detailed story, complete with cutscenes to really help sell the idea that the game was taking place in the same universe we had all come to love. It didn't take too long for a sequel to be released, with Dark Forces 2 releasing just a few years after the original. The second game brought over a lot of what made the first one great, while introducing a new combat system including force powers, and importantly the lightsaber. Now full credit to the developers here, because while the game introduced the lightsaber mechanic about halfway through it, the game's ongoing level design meant that the lightsaber was not always the best tool for the job, and provided a good mixture of level design which required the player to use both the saber and gunplay to reach the game's conclusion. With another hit on their hands, LucasArts wasted no time in announcing a third installment in the series, opting to drop the Dark Forces subtitle entirely and instead use a more appropriate Jedi Knight tag, with Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast releasing in 2002. Jedi Outcast, like its predecessor, used a lot of the same systems and design principles from the last game, for better or worse, more on this later, while taking advantage of technological advancements to deliver an experience with far more scale and a lot more focus on the Force and lightsaber combat. The game's initial release was on PC in March 2002, with versions for the GameCube and Xbox following in November. In a strange turn of events, there was never a PS2 version, which always seemed unusual to me, especially given the install base of the PS2 in most regions was much larger than that of other platforms. Regardless of this, Sony console owners did get a version of Jedi Outcast, releasing alongside a Switch version in 2019. And one of the really interesting things I found was that modern reviews for these platforms are objectively a lot lower scoring than the original releases. I really think this comes down to expectations, because if you go into Jedi Outcast expecting a typical first-person shooter, similar to say Republic Commando, you will be in for a shock. Firstly, Jedi Outcast, even on its easiest difficulty setting, is brutally difficult. Your starting weapons are relatively underpowered, failure of an objective is easy, and the level design is extremely complex, sometimes requiring the player to genuinely explore every part of the level to find the exit. Oh, and the game is dark, not in the philosophical sense, but the lighting in many areas is either low or non-existent, meaning that the player will very frequently need to use their light amplification goggles, which are gated by batteries. The game's story is a definite strength, with it picking up shortly after the last game's conclusion and seeing Kyle Katarn having effectively renounced his Jedi heritage and going back to being a simple mercenary. This provides a convenient backdrop for the game to drip feed the player with new abilities, as opposed to starting the game as a fully fledged Jedi Knight. The story begins with Kyle being sent by the New Republic to explore a variety of strange happenings throughout the galaxy, with it being revealed that there is a deadly new threat for the New Republic, complete with lightsaber-wielding heretics. It's a really well told story that has just the right amount of high stakes and personal involvement, and thanks to some exceptional voice acting and audio design, it really is elevated into the top tier of Star Wars stories. Without going into spoiler territory, I will say that the final level, complete with the very appropriately chosen final dual audio track from Return of the Jedi, is one of the best levels in a Star Wars video game, and really helps to deliver a very satisfying conclusion to the 15-odd hour adventure. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's grab our lightsaber, use the Force, and head back to 2002 to explore Jedi Outcast. While Jedi Outcast is probably best described as a first-person shooter, the reality is that while you can use the first-person view for the entire adventure, the lightsaber combat is probably best handled in third-person, which is what the game defaults to when the lightsaber is selected. However, whichever way you do want to experience the game, you will be dealing with essentially the same gameplay. Firstly, the good. The overall movement and camera control is very good. The staple of WASD and mouse look is in play here, and in the first person mode provides all of the precision you would expect from such a title. Third person is equally solid, and honestly I can't remember a time in the entire adventure where the camera got stuck on any type of level geometry or impeded the playthrough in any way. There are some platforming segments throughout the game, and despite me dying several times because I made the wrong decision, I never actually died because of the controls themselves. Combat is broken up into two parts, standard weapon combat and lightsaber combat. In terms of the standard weapons, you get a fairly good mix of weapons to use throughout the adventure, with everything from blasters to thermal detonators and everything in between. However, I will say that the speed of the projectiles in the game are slower than past entries, requiring you to often close the distance to improve accuracy. This is more of a challenge in the first half of the game before you gain access to some of the more advanced weapons, but it's worth pointing out that this doesn't necessarily make the combat bad, but rather forces a lot more thought to be put into each combat encounter, as overall mobility becomes much more important than a simple point and shoot approach. The lightsaber combat is what I think is as good as it could be for the time. What I mean by that is that the game was very clearly designed as a first-person shooter first, with the third-person lightsaber mechanic being layered on, and that's all fine. However, the inherent decision to make the game a first-person shooter first does show some gaps in the lightsaber combat, mainly in the continuity of attacks. This mostly manifests itself in the game as you only attack exactly what you are pointing at and nothing else around, whereas in some third-person focused saber games which came a little later, such as A Force Unleashed, there's a much greater fluidity to the combat. I want to stress that I'm not knocking the game's implementation of lightsaber combat. I'm merely pointing out that if you are after a purely melee Star Wars title, Jedi Outcast probably isn't it. With all that said, one of the strengths of the game is undoubtedly the sheer variety within the gameplay. Even outside of the various combat models, there's everything from escorting prisoners to taking control of droids and plenty in between. It's a game that very rarely feels boring because there's just so many different things to do. In terms of the game's overall environments and level design, like I said earlier, this is a case of expectation management. The levels are more akin to giant puzzles rather than a straightforward get from point A to point B. There's a mission fairly early on in an Imperial base where you work out that you need to jump onto a moving platform to progress. However, the only time you can jump on this platform is when it's being irradiated inside of a sealed room, which kills you instantly. You can see below this sealed room is an area which you might be able to access in order to disrupt this process, however there's no clear way to access it. It took me so long trying to find a solution to this problem until I finally found a clue in a security camera display, that there might be an entrance to the area in one of the most unlikely places, completely outside of the interior of the base. Armed with this new info, I went exploring in this area and was able to locate the entrance, disrupt the irradiation process, and progress the level. To the game's credit, it always gives you everything you need to find out how to progress, however the way in which it does it at times is very cryptic. Funnily enough, in the very next level there's a similar requirement to find a hidden entrance within a city, complete with several moving platforms which on the surface look like you could jump on them to get where you need to go. Only these platforms kill you when you try to jump on them, proving that just because something worked once does not mean it will work again, and really helps to add depth to the world and provide an even greater challenge. In terms of the things that I don't think work as well as they could, there's really only two things, the difficulty and the pacing. Let me be really clear, I don't have a problem with difficult games, but I do have a problem with games that use objectively cheap mechanics to make them difficult. There were so many times in Jedi Outcast where I died without even knowing where I was shot from, with the most egregious example being an early level flanked by snipers in the middle of the night. I know there's that one Medal of Honor level that gets a bad rap, but honestly what's here is what nightmares are made of. It doesn't help the situation that when you do finally get a weapon capable of returning fire to these snipers, it has one of the slowest charging and longest zooming actions in any video game I've ever played, resulting in the entire level feeling far more of a chore as opposed to a good time. The other cheap difficulty mechanic is the use of enemy grenades. There's a very common class of enemy who has virtually unlimited thermal detonators with very high accuracy, and the added bonus that 9 out of 10 times when you do kill them, they will drop an active grenade. This is made far worse by the fact that these weapons do massive damage to you, and the fact that the game, even on its easiest difficulty, is very lean in providing health. The other part of the gameplay which I think could have been improved is the overall pacing. Probably the best example of this lies within the mission where you encounter the snipers, as the mission directly before it is where you obtain your lightsaber, and you would think that the next level would offer you the ability to use this new weapon. However, the lightsaber is probably the worst weapon you could use in the level, thanks to the majority of enemies attacking from long range, with no easy way to close the gap. Individual opinions on this may vary, but I found the first half of the game much more difficult than the second half, primarily due to the fact that you are just very underpowered for the first half, and even when you do get the lightsaber, you lack a lot of the force powers to use it effectively. The game's presentation is quite good, if not at times suffering from some unusual design decisions, such as the overall quite dark tone in a lot of the level design. The overall graphical fidelity on show is excellent for the time, and despite the game using the id Tech 3 engine, there's so much customization here that it doesn't feel like a generic engine with a coat of paint, rather a deeply curated design which delivers a very faithful rendition of the Star Wars universe. Probably the only downgrade from the past game, which will of course be very subjective, is the removal of the live full motion video cutscenes being replaced by in-engine equivalents. There's probably an argument to be made here that by keeping them in-engine retains a little more of the cohesive experience, but personally I really did enjoy the FMVs. The game's audio is in one word exceptional. Everything from the effects to the voice acting to the soundtrack is perfectly curated for the experience, helping to contribute to a very authentic Star Wars game. Jedi Outcast is a great Star Wars game, it's just not necessarily a great first-person shooter. Ultimately, the deciding factor on if players will enjoy this game comes down to what type of experience they are expecting. For players looking for a run-and-gun shooter set in the Star Wars universe, Jedi Outcast is not that. However, for players looking for a mostly first-person shooting adventure with complex level design requiring time and patience to overcome, then Jedi Outcast fits the bill perfectly. Ultimately, Jedi Outcast was a commercial success and helped pave the way for the final installment in the series, Jedi Academy. Academy took everything that made Outcast good, removed a lot of the things which caused frustration, and reintroduced somewhat of a branching narrative. For me, Academy is the better game, although Outcast still remains a very solid entry in a Star Wars genre that has gone a long time without a meaningful addition. The only question that remains is that if we will ever see another entrance in the Jedi Knight series. However, with over 20 years passing since the last, that hope appears to have all but faded, unless we do still have a very solid library of games in the series with about 100 hours of gameplay between them. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.